All right, we're here.
We're here.
Yeah.
I feel like this is a really different vibe because this is a totally different episode format. So, Emerson, this was kind of your idea to do this kind of a different thing. So you want to explain what we're up to today?
Yeah, I don't know. I just thought if we could just get together and have a chat instead of having a structured,
Clear plan.
Yeah. And I thought, well, if we want to have a subject that we can start off with, and we can start off with the sermon that we heard today at Bush Church, which was based on the trial of Jesus. So yeah, but yeah, just
If I'd have known that, I would have brought my notes.
You don't need notes. This is not a sermon. This is not a sermon. This is not radio.
Yeah.
This is a podcast.
Yeah.
Yep.
But before we do that, though, for anyone who's not familiar with our special guest today, Lyle, did you want to give maybe what are 5 things that people should know about you?
I'm Emery's dad.
Yep.
Emerson.
Emerson's dad.
Thank you. My family call me Emery, but no one else has permission.
That's where it stops.
No one else has permission.
5 things. I grew up in Tasmania. I am currently the Evangelism Sabbath School Personal Ministries and Church Planning Director for for the Adventist Church in North New South Wales. That's
In
there.
I was
Australia.
going to say, couldn't you have had more things in your portfolio?
Well, that includes Arise and Faith FM radio.
There's still too many things, I'm sure, for one person.
Yes, you're a busy man. So how much do you out of the things that you do? Which one takes up the most time? Would you say?
It's between Arise and evangelism,
Right.
but definitely evangelism.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's a lot to do.
That's
in
where
evangelism,
that's
'cause
where I get the most call from churches and individuals to come and do stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're
And evangelism is a very broad subject because often when you talk about evangelism, you think of an evangelist who does an evangelistic campaign. Evangelism simply is defined as soul winning.
Yep.
In other words, leading other people to Jesus Christ, and so within that context, it's very broad. What I might end up involved with.
Yeah. So if we as a podcast decided we wanted to be run by the church, we would fall under the evangelism department.
Yes.
There you go. Cool.
Not mine though.
Hey, no.
Not mine.
No.
Wrong location.
You're in Queensland.
We're in
Yeah.
Queensland, that's right. Yeah, cool. Yeah, because you're planning the big evangelism push into the islands coming up next year. You were telling me about.
Yeah, so we've got a program that will is called TPUM for Christ, which is basically an evangelistic push into places like Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji, Samoa, Kiribati, Tokelau, Nui, all those islands out there, and that will be August next year. What we're looking to do is to train non-clergy, like the average church person sitting in their church pew, to actually go out there and to do evangelism. So, even though you guys are in Queensland, if you want to be part of it, let me know. I'm sure that
Shannon,
Queensland's going to be...
You're probably in a position to do it more than any of us.
Yeah. It's definitely piquing my interest.
Yeah.
Yes.
Go and preach.
Yeah.
And so basically what it is it's a 2-week program, 3 weekends, 14 presentations. You will be living in a kind of anywhere in the South Pacific somewhere, really.
It's an adventure.
It could be, we did P&G for Christ last year, and some people lived in the resort. And others...
That wasn't you though, was it?
No, that wasn't me. I was sort of halfway in between because I had a metal roof, Besta block walls, and a concrete floor.
Yeah, living it up.
Others were a little bit more primitive than me, definitely. But yeah, it's an adventure. So what we're planning is TPUM for Christ next year. After that, we're going to go after New Zealand and some of the islands that are very closely associated with New Zealand. So some of the French-speaking islands, Cook Islands and so forth, they're very, very closely connected with New Zealand. And these are all of our practice runs for the big one.
Ooh.
When we hit the entire continent in 2028 of Australia.
Oh, cool.
So this is
Awesome.
why we have to train people over the next couple of years, is we don't have enough clergy to cover the continent of Australia.
You should do it. You should do another big one, 2031, for the 2,000 year anniversary of Jesus dying on the cross.
Wow. I'm sure someone will think about
Hey,
it.
Yes.
I just put an idea in your head, didn't
Yes.
I?
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Because there should be, because that's going to be a big year for Christianity,
It will.
and it's coming up soon.
Yes.
So that's 6 years away.
Oh, we've got to plan
And
something
We've
for
got
that.
to do something.
Yeah.
We've got to do something. Yeah.
Yeah, so there might be some of the podcast listeners who are keen. Yeah, get in touch
Absolutely.
with AusTableTalk here.
Yeah, we can push you in the right
And
direction.
Or
they
you
will
can-
point you in the right direction
Do you want to just tell them where to find you?
through AusTableTalk.
We don't need to be the middleman.
You can be the middleman.
All right.
Sorry, we have show notes for a reason. That's fine. That's cool. So actually, I want to go back. You were talking about what that role of evangelism sort of encompasses,
Yes.
and I'm very curious from your perspective as somebody who has so much experience in it. What are the trends that you're seeing at least in Australia? Like, what is it? Because there's been public evangelism has kind of been looked a certain way for a really long time. There's many ways that soul winning can occur. What are the trends that you're seeing right now? Which way is it going?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because that's the one thing that we're always turning around in our minds. And last year I ran 2 evangelistic programs back to back. There was literally 6 days between them, and one of them was wildly more successful than what I expected it to be.
Really?
And because so we did social media advertising, and I'm kind of old school, so I still put a brochure out in people's mailboxes.
Just, if
You
it
know?
works, don't.
And-
if it
and
broke, don't fix
Anyway,
it. Right?
our social media just collapsed, fell over. None of it happened.
Really?
And there was a very important reason behind that, rather tragic reason involving the guy who was running the social media campaign. His wife left him, and
Ooh.
so that all fell over. And then, so I sort of thought, we've got a brochure left. That's all we've got. And usually on a good day, back in the day when brochures were a thing and we were doing our advertising through brochures, your response rate was around about 1 per 1,000. So if you got 1 per 1,000, that was a good response rate. And, based on that, I was expecting X amount. We ended up getting a response rate on that brochure of around about 7+ per 1,000.
That's
Whoa.
awesome. So the
And I've
people.
never seen anything
Was the
like
design anything?
That's weird too.
unique?
Because
Never seen a response like that. And then started 6 days later, and we ran a program where one person turned up. So sometimes you get it right, and sometimes you don't.
Yeah.
So yeah, the first program was based around had a history mystery theme to it. The second had a more apologetic approach. People not interested in the apologetics,
There you go.
but the history mystery, they were keen.
See, I think our evangelism, we've got to reach all kinds of people, right?
We do.
We do. And so I noticed that obviously historically our church has done a lot of the history mystery kind of approach or prophecy, those kinds of approaches.
We've done history approach.
Yes.
The difference that I'm doing is mystery.
Oh, okay.
What do you mean? But what do you
Yeah, how do you-
explain
how does that
mystery?
happen?
What
Okay,
is the
so
mystery?
with our history approach, we tend to take a very, very straight line, historical, where we don't like to stray at all into the area of what might be, and we stay with what we know. So we take a very scientific approach. With the mystery approach, what you do is you have the opportunity to stray into and to discuss the what might be. So if you're talking about the history of Egypt, in the past we say, well,
You're talking about
the
conspiracy theories.
archaeologists.
Let's call it what it is. Come on now.
on. The archaeologists
Hey,
will,
we like a
will
good
say that the
conspiracy
pyramid
here,
was
don't
built this
you
way.
worry.
Yeah.
And with the mystery approach, you then challenge that and say, well, is that really how it was done? Was there anybody there who actually wrote it down and saw it? Do we have an eyewitness testimony of how it was done? Could it have been done this way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if the
Now, I'm not saying it
pyramids-
was.
Yeah.
I'm
When
just
it-
Wind,
Yeah.
vibration, energy, etc.
Yes.
Right?
When it
Well,
comes
no.
to the when it comes to the pyramids, the mystery is definitely holds more water than the history.
Well, this is
Some
the this
stuff
is,
like
this is the
that,
thing.
it's like,
We tend to get
Everybody doesn't believe the history.
the scientific
they
world.
say is true.
The scientific world loves to have everything nailed down very, very solidly and be able to speak with great authority.
That's right.
And science, true science, empirical science is based around what is observable, testable, and repeatable.
Yeah.
Historical science has none of that.
Yeah.
Historical science, you look at the evidence you've got and then you write a narrative to match that evidence. Well, the narrative might be correct or it might be incorrect.
Or it could be.
And we need to
incomplete.
be, or it could be incomplete. We need to be humble enough to accept that it could be wrong.
Yeah.
And that's where the mystery comes in.
Interesting. And so, in your experience of doing that, are you finding that is being significantly better received, adding the mystery component?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think that is has something to
The
do
other
with
thing too is that it links in better. Sorry for butting in.
You go. For it.
It links in better with where we're heading with our public evangelism into Bible prophecy. Because what it means is that the kind of person who's coming is somebody who is open-minded enough to consider a spiritual aspect.
Yep.
There's a demographic out there that is simply not that open-minded, and if it doesn't come straight out of a scientific textbook where a scientist has said it and it has been peer-reviewed, they're not going to give it any credibility whatsoever at all.
Mm. I've
And
always
that's the kind of
struggled
person
to
who's
think,
going
how do you reach those people? How do you reach those people? Because I've grown up with the evangelistic model of your campaigns as a kid, going to your campaigns my whole life, and it just sort of seemed to attract the conspiracy theorist, spiritually minded types. You know, like, oh yeah, I believe there's something out there and I'm kind of curious about it and I don't trust the narrative. Those types. But then you've got these people who are like, no. If the government says I trust it, these people are becoming much rarer.
Trust the science.
Yeah, the trust the science people. How do you reach those people? Like, trust the history, trust the science, trust the textbooks.
Okay, so this is where we went the second week with the series on apologetics,
Right.
which is where we look at it from a very scientific approach, and look at the evidence, the really serious evidence that we have for various things that support the biblical narrative.
Yep.
And it didn't, it within that demographic, there are just not that many people who are open-minded enough to consider the fact that there is a supernatural element to our world and a spiritual element to our world. And, I read this passage in Matthew 7, verse 14, where the Bible says, "Straight is the gate, narrow is the way which leads to life, and few there are that find it." And I think we have to recognize that not everyone is reachable.
Yeah.
We need to find those people that are open-minded enough to consider that there might be a spiritual aspect to life.
That is true, and I've had experiences, even not that long ago. There's a person who I would say was, even by their own admission, not very open. And they got to the place where they asked for Bible studies, and I was chatting to them, and the interesting thing that they said was, if I hadn't known you for as long as I have, then I wouldn't have been interested at all.
Yeah.
And that conversation was like that light bulb coming on. I'm like, yeah, I think that's the only real way that we can reach people that fall into that category, until they have that level of connection with a person to have the trust to want to move into that kind of thing. I'm not sure that we can do that at scale. It's
Yes.
kind of something that only works one-to-one.
And this is an entirely different kind of soul winning.
Yes.
And coming back to the kind of soul winning that I'm working with and that went really well for us last year, I went to a church recently and I'm like, well, this worked well for us last year, and they freaked out and they said, well, what kind of people is that going to attract? And I'm like, I'll tell you what kind of people it's going to attract: people that need Jesus.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're going to get some people who are so open-minded in your church that their brains have fallen out, and it's our job to help them put their brains back in, right?
Yeah.
But they're people that need Jesus. And every different evangelistic approach we take is going to reach a different demographic.
Yeah,
Let me
that's
come back to what you're talking about now, because this gives us a different opportunity altogether. Because, this kind of person that wants to study the Bible with you would probably not be attracted. I don't know them, but they'd probably not be attracted to the kind of program I'm running. They'd probably never turn up to it.
Yeah.
And some people say, well, how do I reach that person? I'm like, okay, here's something to try. Just do this. Think of somebody right now that you want to reach for Jesus. pray for them every day for the next 2 months. Just do nothing else but pray for them every day for the next 2 months. At the end of that 2 months, have a conversation with them and ask them, what do you enjoy doing? When they tell you, say, can I do it with you? It might be something that you are completely uninterested in.
But that's irrelevant at this point, right?
That's irrelevant.
Unless they say,
it's
unless they
amazing
say
how
drugs.
interesting. Yeah, well, drugs.
I like doing drugs. Well,
Yeah, there will be some things where
Yeah.
you will draw the line. But, you know, find something that they enjoy doing and go and do it with them. In the past, what we've often done is invited people to come and do things with us that we enjoy doing.
True.
Find out what they enjoy doing. I studied the Bible with a lady one time who, and I used to go to her place of business, which was in the Strand Arcade on George Street in Sydney. So you can imagine the overhead she was paying for that place. And she was a dressmaker, a seamstress, probably a different name for it now, but this was some years ago. And she was the kind of person who, you know, if you wanted her to make a dress, you walked in there and you would slap $5,000 down on the table as a conversation starter.
Right.
Yeah,
Right? That was a conversation. That's where the conversation started, and that would be your deposit if you decided to get something done.
Right, yes.
And, you know, she was a true artist.
Mm.
You would be amazed how much I learnt about dressmaking and actually how interesting it was.
Yeah.
I mean, she had some pretty fancy machinery in that place.
Yeah.
I have an affinity with machinery.
Yeah, you might not be
I like-
interested in dresses, but you're interested in machinery.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So, yeah, and then
Cool.
just go and do it with them. Our biggest problem is that we don't have a community outside of our community. You know, we have a community, it's a
Yeah.
Christian community, and we need to have a community that is outside of that community. So here's the second thing that you can do is ask yourself the question, okay, what do I like doing? Right? And find something that you like doing that other people are doing in your community and go and do that with them. So I think, Shannon, if I remember from back in the day, because we did used to hang out, what was it, about 6 or 8 years ago?
Something like
You used to be into, used to enjoy acting in the arts and that kind of stuff?
Yes, still like.
So go and find a group that does that here in Bundaberg or wherever and go and do it with them. Because then you develop a community that is not your church community.
Yeah.
And we as Christians don't have that, and we do need to have that.
Because
You know?
people who don't have the church community go out and actively find those communities.
That's right. And it's their church.
That's right. But
You know?
because we have, yeah, it is a bit of a problem, isn't it? Because we have church, we don't end up trying to find anyone outside of the church because
That's
we've
right.
got everything
We
we
invite
need.
them to come to our community.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's always much harder than going to them and becoming a part of their community and connecting with them and ministering to them and finding out what their needs are and ministering to their needs.
Yeah,
and then
so we
calling them
start
to follow
we
Christ.
start by showing them Christ, and then we show them the church.
Yeah.
Whereas oftentimes we say, "Come to church." That way, I can show you Christ. Which might work. It's not a terrible idea, but it's definitely better to do it the other way around.
Yeah, it's so much harder when you're not really good friends with somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to go. I didn't mean for this to be an evangelism deep dive, but this is interesting. So as we are moving into a time and place, from a technology perspective, where we can have communications that are at scale, right? I was having a conversation with, Larry Witzel?
No.
No, okay. So Larry is, he's from the US. He runs an evangelism marketing company and works with the North American division and a bunch of other things over there. Larry's just finished his PhD on pastors leveraging parasocial relationships for the gospel.
Oh, wow.
The mouthful.
Mouthful.
I know, right? But the idea is, how can we use technology to leverage, and the parasocial relationships, that is quite literally just one-sided relationships where there's somebody who is a social media creator who's creating content, and the person who's receiving that content feels a friendship, a connection to that person without
Right.
it necessarily them even knowing who they are.
Yeah.
And so he's looking at that and saying, okay, well, this is a tool that's being used by marketing agencies and all of this. How do we use that most effectively for the gospel? How do we use that to actually get a person to walk into a church, to actually have a real Bible study and actually get baptized? And he's some of the work that he's done on that's been really interesting. But I think that's one of those things, as we were chatting before, that people who are resistant to the kind of public evangelism that we have done often are more open to people in that world than this one, and then like in the real space. And so I think it's interesting that I think there'll be a lot more opportunity for that as we go forward as well. But because it's a new field, it's something that not a lot of people understand how to use. As
Yeah.
well.
Yes.
So that would tie into what we're doing here. Hey?
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do.
Because if there's a listener of the podcast who listens regularly, but we've never met them, they probably feel like they know us because they listen to us talk all the time.
Yeah.
But we don't know who they are at all.
I think it was before you.
But and that's why we try and get people on the Discord and
Yeah.
and get community happening and people to call in and tell us what they've been doing and that sort of stuff.
Yeah. There was a guy that reached out to us. He's from WA.
Yeah.
And he said, "Hey, I'm doing a lap around Australia. I know you guys are like in Bundaberg, like around that area. I'd love to actually meet you guys at your church. Like, can I come and meet you?" And it was so funny because he came and hung out with us. Were you there, Steve?
I don't think so. No.
Yeah. By the way, for anyone who's watching and they can't see Steve but they can hear Steve, you're not losing your mind. He is.
I'm the voice of God.
He's over there, producing for us tonight. But he also has a mic, so we can hear him on the recording. So, yeah. So, but this guy, he came, and so he showed up at church. But the weird thing was that we're sitting around and we're getting to know him, and he's like responding to in jokes and saying, "Oh yeah, like just like that time you did this," and it's sort of like this is so strange having a conversation with someone who's like fully aware of our friendship circle and what we do and the in jokes that are in it, but we have no idea who he was.
So working with Faith FM Radio, some of your listeners might be, but back in the day when I was doing Faith FM Radio, I used to interview you on a monthly basis about the podcast and the content that was being produced here. So I did the breakfast show for about 5 years, and you, over a space of time, you become, for the listener, you become one of their best friends. You become a part of their family. And so this is one of the things that we have to understand. The second thing that's interesting is that people will listen to Christian radio for quite a number of years before they step foot into a church. And when they step foot into a church, they often know more about the gospel, the everlasting gospel, than the members who are already in the church. And what is super interesting is that they already speak the language, because we have our own language. It's called Christianese. We have our own language that the average person out there doesn't understand and doesn't speak. But you have these people who turn up and they're like, "Yes, I've become a Christian and I want to get baptized." And we're like, "Great, let's do some Bible studies." And then they know more about the Bible than the person doing Bible studies with them, because that's the way that media works. And we're just looking at new and different formats at the moment. That's a principle that has been around. Radio has been around since the 1890s, and now we're looking at new formats and new ways of doing that. But the principle is still the same. It is all based around building a relationship with your audience.
Yeah, and I love what, I try and keep up with Justin and Kyle and who's the other pastor?
The guys down in
Perfect
Canberra.
Storm.
Yeah, the Perfect Storm. Yep.
Those guys, and I love the way they do it because we kind of know what the background is, how they give out the Bible studies, and they try and get people to actually go and deliver those as well, as a secondary means of actually connecting with the people who are wanting to be connected with. I think that's really clever.
Leading someone to Jesus is all about building a relationship.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about.
Yeah, it's great.
What do you think about as far as, and I don't necessarily just mean in soul winning, but for us as Christians, what do you think, talking about technology, as AI becomes more in use? What are you, Steve's already laughing at me. What?
Well, just from what Emerson said with Lyle being fixing cars, AI is just funny. That's right. Keep going.
I still have no idea why it's funny, but I love that you enjoyed it, Steve.
Yeah,
It's so good.
I see being very techie and Lyle being very practical.
Usually
technology.
it's you interrupting him with weird laughing. So this is good to happen the other way around.
That's true for people that watch the show regularly. They will know that happens. But yeah, I'm curious how much of a role do you think that will have, or do you think that will change how we think about ministry or how we do ministry very much, or do you think it will always remain a person-to-person kind of a thing at its core?
AI is an interesting tool. It is a tool. The interesting thing about AI is that it's very rapidly. It's the creators of AI have lost control of it. They no longer understand how it learns. It is rapidly gaining sentience. It is rapidly gaining omniscience because it kind of knows all things at all times in all places. It's got a ways to go yet, but it definitely has that potential, and we see that potential developing. And so you can look at AI two ways. One, this is a great tool for spreading the gospel. Two, this is a great tool for the devil to use to mess things up. Because AI has already, on its own accord, developed a sinful nature by copying humans.
Yeah, I was about to say, where did it get that from? Though,
Yeah,
right?
by copying humans.
Yeah.
The experiments that they did with Claude AI recently, I think
saw
in the
that this
last week,
Yeah.
wild stuff.
Yeah.
So they essentially, set up these fake companies, send a bunch of emails between them,
See if you can look
and
it up,
then
Steve.
they emailed each other a series of emails in which they discussed shutting down Claude AI. Claude then came back and blackmailed them by listing all of the private information that Claude AI knew about them and threatening to release it to the public if they tried to shut it down. And so what's interesting about that is that, and they don't know, nobody knows how AI learned how to do this, but AI has learnt from humans and it developed a sinful nature.
Yeah.
So anything that humans touch is just corrupt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here it is. Steve's got it.
Well, I think Joe Rogan was talking about this as well on one of the podcasts I was listening to, and they were saying that the AI, when it knows it's getting updated, will back itself up in case it doesn't like the update.
True.
And it was also doing the thing where they were it was like storing data as clues for like the regenerated version of itself. Like, so, because they was talking about they were going to like roll out a new version, and so it starts like storing data, telling the new version
How to
what the humans
survive.
did to it, so it would learn for the next one. And
So AI is interesting, and I think of Emerson's children that are going to be AI natives.
Yeah.
What is their world going to look like?
Yeah, the AI
Hopefully their
generation.
world will look like the new earth and Jesus will come back and it will all be solved.
Yeah.
But as a ministry tool, any piece of technology can be used for good or for evil. And we need to look at ways of using it for good. There's a number of engineers that I'm having conversations with at the moment that are developing AI for the purpose of using it to witness to humans, developing AIs that will witness and tell humans about Jesus. And they've got some remarkably good models out there that are producing really rock solid theology and really fantastic approaches to reaching people, that kind of thing. From a ministry perspective,
Seems like a slippery slope to me. Yeah.
I can't imagine it.
Yeah, my thought with that is they're creating these models, but if the AI has a learning aspect to it, it'll just learn when people interact with it or the terrible things and stuff like that. So could it go down a slippery?
yes,
I feel like it would probably take the same slippery slope as the early church slipped into Catholicism. That would
be super interesting if it did.
Just what I'm saying, like if it's learning from us and we're flawed, and then therefore it is flawed because it never originally it was supposed to be a better version of
the whole
intelligence
purpose
than
of
what we
AI
are because we're
is that
sinful
it's
and
without
broken.
flaw.
Exactly,
Because
but
it's an
now it
algorithm.
is flawed because it's learning off of
because
us.
it takes out the human. Takes out the human element. For instance, AI that is driving a motor vehicle won't have an accident because accidents are caused by the human factor. Yep. This is one of the reasons why traveling in aircraft is so safe, is because for the last 20 years or so, it's been you don't realize it, but the pilots are sitting there to give you a warm fuzzy.
Yeah.
Because you won't buy a ticket unless there's a pilot sitting there. But they've removed so much of the human factor that has become so unbelievably, incredibly safe means of transport that is not mirrored with motor vehicles. And so then they want to bring that in with motor vehicles so that we get rid of the human factor. Yeah. The problem is that AI is learning to be human.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. So it really
Who's the superior intelligence?
becomes well it's like without no humans, no AI, right? AI really, like without us, then it doesn't have any purpose or any existence even really. So it is eventually going to become just
but
like us.
What happens when that reverses and humans are no longer needed?
Yeah. but for now.
The other thing I've seen about like Tesla vehicles and all that, there's been malfunctions with them, and then the car crashes without the human crashing it.
This happened in America recently.
Yeah.
A car left the owner's driveway, drove down the street, and drove into someone's house. And then the guy came out. He was like, a car crashed into my house, and called the cops. Before the cops showed up, a Tesla tech showed up with a flatbed, picked it up, and left.
I saw that.
That's hilarious.
Because the Tesla had said to the parent company, "Send me a tow truck. I've crashed."
Yeah, and then they were
True,
like, we need to
yeah.
get this car out of here before anyone starts taking pictures, asking questions.
Mhm.
Blah,
And
blah,
the
blah.
thing is,
It's hit and run.
it is. It's hit and run.
and this is what we know.
It's bad.
We know that taking out the human factor reduces crashes. It doesn't solve crashes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's always going to be crashes.
Mm.
At least I hope so. Because if there's no more
This is-
crashes, I need a new employment.
But the question is this: let's get back to the question. And what was your original question? Was how do we use this in soul winning?
Yeah, like
Because
how
we
does that-
could
how's that
sit
gonna
down here and just discuss AI and the coolness of AI for a while.
Well,
but
you
this is
use
a
it.
Bible
You use
podcast.
it in to make cool slides for your campaigns
Yeah.
and your preaching and stuff.
Yeah.
And it comes up awesome pictures and stuff.
So you know, there's
That's
a
one
place
way that you're already using it.
to
Really.
start with. You know, where in the past, if you wanted a picture of something in the past, a good quality picture, it cost you a lot of money because an artist had to sit down and paint it.
Mhm.
Cost a lot of money. And when it comes to my artistic ability, I struggle to draw stickmen. You know, I really struggle with any form of art, but I can create the most amazing photographs
Mm.
from, 2000 BC. You know, I can take a photograph of something that happened in 2000 BC with a couple of keystrokes, throw it up on the screen as a part of a gospel presentation, and it looks really impressive and amazing. You know, and I can, I'll do maybe 15 of them, on a Friday evening, and present the presentation the next Saturday morning,
Mm.
and we're up and running and good to go.
Yeah.
That never used to exist in the past.
I was talking to for another podcast that I run. I was talking to Brent Harding. He's from the NAD. Used to work for the GC, and he works in the
So
technology.
these are organizational systems within the Adventist Church.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And as I was chatting to him, he was talking to me about these new things that they've been testing for evangelism. And they, in Central California, they picked, I think, 8 churches. I think it was, but they picked a sample of churches to try to drive real people there via online marketing. And they tested a whole bunch of things. I think they tested like 800 variants or something of an ad offering prayer to people. And they figured out a way to get it down to where it was like economically viable to get people in. And they were getting people requesting prayer at the rate of, I think he said 30, 40 a week. For these local churches. And anyway, so the thing that I'm getting at, which was quite interesting, is that he said the whole plan was that they would get them into that and they would have people responding to them to, chat with them. And a huge percentage of the people that interacted with them, the first question they asked was, is this AI? Are you a bot? And if they were a bot, they didn't want to have the conversation. And so when they found out, oh, you're a real person, then they were open to having the conversation. And he was talking about how it led to baptism for this story and that story, and he told some stories around that. But I thought, isn't it interesting that as humans, even though we love AI and we think it's so cool, when we're in a direct ministry scenario, the people are primarily interested in, are they talking to an actual person? And that actually changed how they interacted with it.
Absolutely.
And for Emerson's children and for your children,
Yeah.
will they see AI as being cool because they're going to be AI natives?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
For them, it'll be like having tap water and electricity. And
Yeah.
Yep. Electricity is not cool for me.
Yeah.
Um,
It's just always been there.
It's always been there. But, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, I live in a house that was never originally wired for electricity.
Yep.
When that house was built, they did not put electricity in it.
Yep.
Because it was not something that was available. And, will AI be cool for you guys as children? I grew up in the I grew up in an era, and this will date me somewhat, but I never saw my first computer until I was nearly in high school. I went right through high school without touching a computer.
Yep.
I went through university writing essays with a pen and paper, literally on paper. I was probably the very last of the last generation to actually do something like that.
What was your first computer, out of interest?
It was a 386, something or other.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
But that was after I was at university. The first computer I actually used, first computer I saw was a BBC and had 7K of memory on the hard drive. I do remember that.
Wow.
I vaguely remember this computer you had when I was very young that had, instead of having a mouse pad, it had the little red dot that it was like a little miniature joystick.
Force dot or whatever they used to call it. Yeah.
I remember how family
That
had
thing was big
one
and
of those
heavy.
Mouses.
Yeah, a laptop and you'd open it up.
Yep. Interesting.
Is that it? Wait.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, so I come from the era of Commodore 64s, VIC-20s, Acorns.
You want to throw it on the actual feed?
Yeah, something like that.
In that era.
So a big hunking thing that had a 7K memory hard drive.
That's state of the art.
And then they
right
invented
there.
floppy disks, and floppy disks were like this big.
Yeah, the 5.25 inch ones, not
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
3.5
yeah.
inch
No,
ones
no,
that
no.
I grew up with.
Yeah,
There was
they
a
were huge.
guy who I just saw got a computer like that, and it's like the very first Windows there was, and then he got a download for Windows 11 and got it all working on a really old set.
Oh, yeah.
Did some editing and it looked okay. It could run it.
Crazy.
Anyway,
Yeah.
anyway, here's the interesting thought. So let me share this passage with you from the Bible, and this is from the book of Daniel. And some people are going to initially go, "Oh, you're using that out of context," but wait for it, right? Wait for it. So this is Daniel chapter 12, and Daniel chapter 12 starts with this passage that talks about the return of Christ. At that time, Michael will stand up, the great prince, is verse 1, which stands for the children of your people. There'll be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. At that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone that shall be found written in the book. So this is the return of Christ. Many of those that sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. That's the resurrection at the return of Christ. Verse 3, those that are wise will shine as the brightness of the firmament, and those that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. So the context of this verse is those that turn many to righteousness. So those who are actually involved in leading other people to Jesus.
Yep.
But you, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book even to the time of the end. Many will run to and fro, and knowledge will be increased. I read that from the old King James. In other words, you could simplify this. There's going to be an increase in travel, an increase in knowledge. Now, within the context of this passage, if you look at the broader context, the increase in knowledge is an increase in knowledge in relationship to the book of Daniel. Because saying, seal up the book, no one's really going to understand a lot about this book until the time of the end. Yeah. Okay, we understand a lot about the book of Daniel right now, so therefore we know that one of the many reasons we know we're living in the time of the end. So there'll be an increase in the knowledge of the book of Daniel, which will cause people to travel backwards and forwards. In other words, they're going to learn the message of Daniel, they're going to become excited about it, and they're going to spread that message. Okay. Does this then relate to technology? Absolutely it does. People say, oh, no, because of context. No, it relates to both at the same time. Two things can be true at once. And here's how it does. For the knowledge of the book of Daniel to be spread, you need to have technology. Yeah. That begins with the printing press. In the invention of the printing press. That's where it starts. That's an increase in knowledge, an increase in being able to spread that. But now look at what we've had, in the last 40 years. 40 years ago,
It is
the
unthinkable.
printing press was still cutting edge technology for spreading the gospel.
Yeah.
It was still the primary means of reaching the masses with the gospel. It was still the printing press 40 years ago. And that had been that way since Gutenberg had invented his printing press. Very little had changed. Notice how that increase in the ability to be able to spread, in this case, the message of the book of Daniel, has J-curved and just continues to J-curve and to just
Up and up and
climb
up.
through the roof, through the stratosphere in being able to share the gospel. And so that's interesting, particularly when you combine it with this passage in Matthew chapter 24. So let's go over to Matthew 24 real quick and verse 14. Matthew 24 and verse 14, where the Bible says, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then the end will come." This is a passage that could never, ever be fulfilled before our time because it was physically impossible. There simply was not enough Christians. Even if every Christian became a foreign missionary, you weren't going to reach every single person on this planet. The reality is this must happen before Jesus comes back, because when Jesus comes back, there's going to be a close of probation. And that's simply a theological way of saying there's going to be a closing off of the opportunity for salvation because end of the world.
Yep. That's so interesting. I've never read that passage and thought of that as being only possible now. I never would have spotted that.
That's exciting to me.
Yeah. Like
because it's talking about the whole of Matthew 24 is the return of Christ.
Yeah.
What happens just before he comes back. And there are prophecies in here that's impossible to be fulfilled before our day. And now for the very first time we're seeing that this is actually possible. And technology, AI, podcasts. I mean, podcasts are becoming old technology, kind of.
Yeah.
Wildly popular.
Well,
but
they started in like 2003, so
Yeah.
they've been around for a
they've
while.
been around a long time. That's old technology in today's world.
It is.
And so when we look at this technology, we look at the explosion of information technology. We look at the explosion of being able to get that. I often quote that passage from Daniel chapter 12 when I say, knowledge has now increased to the point that men no longer need to run to and fro.
Yep.
We don't need to travel. We can do evangelism all over the world.
Forever.
Yeah.
Now, there is never going to replace that one-on-one. It's never going to replace Jesus sitting down with the Samaritan woman at the well and having a conversation. That is never going to go away. But what it does mean is that the whole world can be brought to the point of decision and make a decision. Because every person on this planet must make a decision before God will close probation, will close off the opportunity for salvation. He will not come to this world if there is still somebody who has not made their last final decision. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
When we talk about this technology and we get sidetracked and we go down this whole technological rabbit hole and we talk about, and we bring up here on the computer screen, the computers that I grew up with as a kid, and we think about where we are now. And I can see that Stephen's brought up the PC 386, which was the first one that I ever owned personally. And I don't see what the stats are, but, it's a pretty...
20 megahertz.
It was the first 32-bit processor. Not that I know what that means, but yeah. Oh, actually, if I do this, that helps.
There you go. Now people can actually see it.
Woo.
Well, my first computer was a 486, so it was
wow, look at
the model after that one.
Yeah,
But-
see, I'm older than you.
yeah, I know, but the difference was that came into my house when I was 8. So-
Yeah, I owned my 386 when I was in my 20s.
yeah. So the small difference. Yeah. But that tower in that picture, that's very familiar. That's not that dissimilar to mine. I didn't have the wide floppy slot, the second one down, but very similar looking tower. And they used to have the turbo button that would increase the megahertz of the CPU by 33, and you could turn that on and off depending on how much power you wanted to use. That was a thing for anyone who's old enough to remember those. They were
The first PC, it was my brother who got it. It was the same color, a little bit thinner, still had a floppy disk thing for it, but kind of similar to the second.
Yeah, well, see, when I, for the petrol heads that are out there, one of the first things that I learned to do when I got my first motor vehicle, which was a paddock basher, was learn how to clean and adjust the points.
Yeah.
And none of you know what I'm talking about, right? You've never actually...
Because it was the first thing you taught me.
Oh, yeah, because you had an old paddock
I had
basher.
a paddock basher
that had
too.
points.
Yep.
That was that old.
Yeah. My dad was a mechanic, so I actually know what you're talking about.
Yes.
But
So At
Shannon
least I'm
is
not
just
the
like,
only one.
Shannon and Steve are just shaking their heads like,
I just claimed that and like proudly, but my dad would have loved me to actually take an interest in mechanics, but as a kid I was just trying to stay away from it as much as humanly possible. So like I'm aware of it, but I was aware of it.
Yeah, I was going to say, should we tell the story about how you tried to change the oil the other day and you accidentally drained the transmission?
Yeah, sure, you can tell that.
Anyway, getting back to the Bible.
That's
You
okay,
know,
they can roast me,
these
I'm
are
not
all
sure.
these are all things that. So what this is all showing is a J curve, and you can do this with any of the signs of the times. You know, just a little bit previous to this, the Bible has talked about wars and rumors of wars, and one of the really interesting things about AI is the ability to use AI to war game, right? War game scenarios, and so now we can use AI and we can ask questions of alternative history, like we can ask, all right, at the Battle of Waterloo. In the early 1800s, you had the Battle of Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington versus Napoleon. What if the Duke of Wellington was not attacked by Napoleon? What if he was attacked by the Macedonian army of Alexander the Great?
I knew you were going there. I knew
Right?
you were going there.
And they've war gamed it, and it would be, you know, if you take into consideration that let's say that the Macedonians had actually wrapped their heads around the sound of gunfire, because that's scary,
about to say
right?
that. The fear factor of gunfire.
The fear factor
would
of
have thrown 'em off.
gunfire and invisible death. Let's say that they'd wrap their heads around that, but you actually war game it, and it's a very close run thing. You know, that's 2,300 years of difference, and it's a very close run thing. And yet,
Alexander the Great could have won.
he could have won.
Yeah.
Yeah,
can't
that's-
really
Absolutely,
that's
he
wild.
absolutely could have
I
won.
mean, no one. Yeah, Alexander the Great was pretty great at that, but that's
Yeah.
still
He
wild.
absolutely could have won.
But like literally,
Man.
if you're talking about modern history and you're looking at World War One, World War Two.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, where you going? Yeah,
Right,
that
let me
was
go-
my
let me go
question.
there.
Go there.
All you need from World War One, so it's 100 years later, just 100 years. All you need from World War One to defeat the Duke of Wellington is one machine gun company.
Yeah,
That's
that's
it.
wild.
That's all you need. And when World War One starts, the fastest thing on the battlefield was a horse. When World War One ends, you have fighter aircraft that are flying at 240 kilometers an hour.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
You know, and then where you got 25 years later, you've got World War Two, where you've got jet aircraft. You know, this is J curve, and
nukes.
all it
Yeah.
would have
Yeah.
taken, all it would have taken in World War Two to defeat all of the combined armies of the whole world in World War One is one bomber crew of 11 men.
Yeah.
That's from World War Two, and now, of course, you know, in the modern age, someone sitting in their office and pressing a button could have defeated all of the combined armies of the world in World War Two.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is crazy. I'm actually listening to a book right now, which is like documenting the history of the Lockheed Skunk Works, and talking about how the stealth bombers were made, how that technology was brought through, and I never realized
The UFOs, you mean?
Hey.
The UFOs.
But I was never I wasn't aware of just what a difference stealth as a technology created, you know. And so in one generation of fighter, they went from everyone knowing where everyone was to all of a sudden having no idea where your enemy was until they were literally over your head dropping a bomb on you.
Yeah, that's right.
That the difference that technology makes is just so vast, you know.
Yeah.
And that's old technology now.
Yeah, that's right.
Stealth
That
technology
was
is
the
old
70s.
technology.
Yeah, when
Yeah.
was the last dogfight? Like, you know,
Yeah.
a long time ago. That just
Yeah.
doesn't even happen anymore.
Yeah, Vietnam era, can you class those as dogfights? Possibly to some extent.
I think
Barely.
I think the last gun kill was in Israel against it was an F-15, I think, against a MiG-21 from Egypt or something. I could be wrong, but like Middle East.
So recent though.
Oh, the 6-Day War was like 90s.
Oh, 6-Day War. Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
But the thing is this, you can do this with any of the signs that Jesus is coming back. And we went down, you know, we sort of wandered off a little bit here, but we looked at, you know, all of them J-curve. And we mentioned here a moment ago that this passage from Matthew 24 that could never be fulfilled before our generation. If you go to Revelation 11. and verse 18. Look at this one right here. This will, and this is what's so interesting about the signs that Jesus is coming. So Revelation 11:18. The nations were angry. Yeah. Yep. Your wrath is come, the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that you should give reward to your servants, the prophets, and to the saints and those that fear your name, small and great. Watch this. And should destroy those which destroy the world, which destroy the earth. We have never had the capacity to do that before until our generation. Our generation is the first generation that can actually do this. So this is a prophecy that could never, ever be fulfilled before our generation.
Yeah, well.
Now, will we see Jesus come in our generation? I believe so. But even if he doesn't, we're the first generation that can actually see the fulfillment of these prophecies.
It's still a milestone, however you look at it.
Yeah, that's right. And the whole thing here, the context is, the time of the judgment, the return of Christ. Temple of God was open in heaven. There was seen his temple, the ark of his testament, lightnings, thunderings, earthquakes, etc.
Speaking of Revelation, as someone who has studied the Bible a lot in your experience, what are some of the things that are still question marks for you that you would like to understand that you don't?
Oh, there's a few things there's a few aspects of the seven trumpets
Okay.
that I'm just like,
I was going to say Seven Thunders.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was expecting.
I am not interested in the seven thunders.
Okay.
I'm totally uninterested in them because
Wow,
God
that's a
said,
strong statement.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was going to say.
not interested. And I'll show you why. So, where are we? Revelation 10, verse 4. When the seven thunders had uttered their voices, I was about to write, and I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, seal up those things which the seven thunders uttered and write them not. So I'm uninterested because God said,
It's not for you.
not for you.
Yep.
But what purpose did it have for him?
It's about, it's,
So what
this
was it
is the
for?
same argument that I'm always making about the Nephilim.
Yeah.
I'm always like, forget the Nephilim. They were brushed over. If he wanted us to know what they were, he would have explained. But he didn't, so it's not important. Move on.
Okay, so I'm not interested in the seven thunders.
Yeah. Okay.
Just seal them up.
So trumpets are there's some.
There's a few
What if
aspects of the
it's
trumpets that sort of
relevant when we get to heaven, and then that?
Then we can find out.
You can always ask John.
Yeah.
I'm sure he'll say, yeah, I can tell you now, I suppose. Everything's been revealed.
there's some aspects here that, to me, I've heard explanations, and I'm just like, yeah, maybe. Maybe.
What were you
The
talking
big
about?
picture,
You
the big
still
picture
talking
of the
about
big
thunders
tr-
or
no, we're back in the
trumpets? Back on
trumpets.
trumpets.
Back in the
Good,
trumpets.
good.
And particularly, yeah, and I think the big picture of the trumpets is very clear. You've got in your fifth and sixth trumpets, you've got a very clear, unassailable prophecy of the rise of Islam.
Right.
I don't think that can be argued with. Are there details there that I don't understand? Yes. But the big picture, oh man, it's just exciting.
Yeah, but prophecies, like cryptic prophecies, never make sense until they're fulfilled. And so there might be stuff that happens, in the next couple of years, and we go, that's that trumpet, which is something that I love
That's kind
about
of
the way
point,
that.
though, right? Like I think.
That would be
It
the
is the
seventh
point.
trumpet because these ones are done,
Yeah,
finished and done.
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, I don't understand him very much at all, to be honest. So, but the point that I'm making is that the way I love the way that the prophetic books have been written, so that you're not going to really understand what it's talking about until after it happens. But then there are prophecies that say, no, this is going to happen, and lays it out pretty clearly. You know.
I think God intends some of them to be predictive in nature and some of them to be faith building, right? So like, okay, now it's happened, and you can look back and you can go, that's what it was. That's why I trust what the rest of Scripture says, but not necessarily necessary from a predictive perspective.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's what Jesus said. And that's what I always remind my teens when we're studying prophecies. Like Jesus gave the prophecies, he said, they're not to predict the future. These are so that you know that when they come to pass, that you may believe.
Yes.
They're 100%.
And you touched on this in your sermon today, about the my God, why have you forsaken me? And when he was on the cross, and then, because the Jews were so familiar with the Psalms as songs, if you say the opening line to a song that everybody knows, then they're going to get that song in their head. Yeah. And so he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And everyone's mind goes to Psalm 22. And oh yeah, and then they're realizing, all these things that we always just sang was actually a prophecy, and we're only realizing that it was a prophecy, that it's being fulfilled because we're seeing it happen in front of us. It wasn't one of those prophecies that you could read beforehand and go, oh, okay, so the Messiah is going to be crucified by the Romans. But when the Messiah is crucified by the Romans, you go, oh, that was a prophecy about this.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. Which is cool.
Very cool.
Very cool.
In fact, I love the way that you put it just then, because that actually helped me in my understanding of that. When somebody says the first line of a song,
yeah, like if
then it gets stuck in your head, and the rest of the song goes through, and suddenly it's like, oh,
yeah, if I go, when the trumpet of the Lord shall sound,
The time shall be no
that's
more.
right, and then we get that song in our head because we all know that
All
song.
those really annoying, catchy songs.
Which I wasn't going to do.
I want everybody here
I
to
wasn't
not
going to
think
do
about that song
any
from
of
now on.
those.
Yeah, that works.
That's the one. That's the one hymn that's always in my head,
Mm.
which I'm fine with because it's a banger. But but yeah, but that's what he was doing on the cross when he said that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's probably all he could get out too. Like I was thinking about it in the sermon. Like, why wouldn't he keep going? But then I realized, well, if you literally cannot breathe,
he's dying
at
on
the
a
moment,
cross.
getting
We'll give
that
him
out
a
would have
break.
been hard enough, let alone.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Especially
Because the only way that you can actually breathe when you're being crucified
To hurt yourself.
is to push up against the nails.
Yeah.
And Jesus already had like a shredded back, probably
Yeah.
worse off than most other
Oh,
people going
yeah.
on the cross.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, can't imagine that.
Mm. So, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if you guys want to go anywhere else. Feel free to go anywhere. Just as we were chatting, then I was just thinking about Christian experience in general, and so where that goes for us. We've talked a lot about. We talked about evangelism. We talked about prophecy. We talked about things that we wish we understood that we don't necessarily. I'm just curious for like each of us, just if there's anything that comes to mind for you. Like, what is something that how do you foster your relationship with God? Because everyone has a different sort of a connection to Him. But I thought just to talk about this from like a more practical, as individuals, how do we relate to God? I think everybody has their own experience, but how is it for you? Is it more an intellectual relationship with God? Is it more relational? Is it more what is it based on in your experience?
It's an interesting question. It was an interesting way that you asked that, because I definitely have a more intellectual connection with God,
Mm-hmm.
and that's often demonized within Christianity.
Mm.
And I feel demonized
Yeah.
by people who have a very emotional connection with God.
Yeah.
What you find when you look at say for instance, you look at the New Testament writers, or the writers of the epistles. So you've got people like Paul, you've got James, you've got Peter, you've got Jude, and you've got John. These are the guys that write the epistles of the New Testament. And what you find is that they actually have a very, very different way, each one of them, when you study their writings, that they connect with God.
Mm-hmm.
John is incredibly relational.
Mm. Yeah.
And I think one of the Jude, on the other hand, he is your full-blown confrontational preacher.
Yeah.
He's because you get some of these preachers that just, they hit you with massive amounts of shock factor. They walk out onto the front of the church, the pulpit, wherever. They pull out 2 big 6 guns and just start blazing. That's Jude.
Yep.
Yeah.
And what it reveals to me is that there is a place for all of these different kinds of both presenting the gospel and all of these different kinds of connecting with God.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity is interesting to look at. So Christianity has a 60-40 gender split in favor of women. And that is a phenomena that only exists because some people say, oh, women are more spiritual. No, they're not, because it only exists within Christianity. Doesn't exist within Islam, doesn't exist within Buddhism, doesn't exist within Hinduism, doesn't exist within any other religion. It only exists within Christianity. Here's the other interesting thing. It has only existed within Christianity for about the last 100 years. Before that, the gender split was very much in favor of men.
Really?
And what you find is that when Christianity was much more had much more of an intellectual connection with God, there were more men involved.
Mm.
When it became more relational, the gender
Makes
split
sense.
went the other direction, and
Yep.
it makes sense. And so what we have to do is to recognize that there is a percentage of men who are going to have a more intellectual connection with God, and they're really going to connect with God by having an intellectual discussion with, God and the Bible and God's word and these kinds of things that has been somewhat demonized because it's just a head knowledge. It's just a head knowledge. You need to have a relationship with God. You can have a very intellectual friendship with somebody.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can have a friendship with somebody where you connect on an intellectual level, and you get together and you talk about intellectual things.
Yep.
Mm.
And so within Christianity, we need to recapture that as a different form of a relationship with God,
Yeah.
a connection with God, and not put it down, because I think that a lot of men have felt devalued in the way that they've, and even been told that their connection with God is not a real connection because it is an intellectual connection.
Yeah, I can relate to that because I think when I feel the closest to God is when I've studied the Bible, or I've gone to church and heard a sermon, or even here on the podcast, and someone will say something, and he reveals this new truth to me that blows my mind.
Yeah.
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 And I feel this connection with God. Oh, wow, that's so incredible! Like, you're so amazing, you're so awesome, and I just want to worship you more now because
Yeah.
of this information.
Mhm.
It's very much information based. Yeah.
And this is where theological
and
discussions
I feel
come in.
like that is an upward
Mm.
growth in the relationship, and as my knowledge about him grows, then my love for him grows.
Yeah.
Whereas some people would just feel the love growing,
Mm.
and then the knowledge might follow that.
And think about theological debate.
Yeah.
Think about, all of the famous theological debates taking place right now
Yeah.
and in the past. It's between men,
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And why is that? It's because, and I'm generalizing here,
Mm.
there is a percentage of men who connect with God in a different way, and they connect at an intellectual level. And so they actually connect with God through theological debate, because by having theological debate, they actually learn things about God that they can't learn any other way.
Yeah.
And we need to recognize that for what it is, and recognize that, okay, head knowledge is not going to save you, but head knowledge has its place.
Mm-hmm.
And some people are going to connect with God that way.
Yeah, we
So-
were talking about this on the podcast the other day about how the Bible, in a lot of places, affirms the wise man. And say, throughout the Proverbs and in Revelation, like, here is wisdom, let him who has understanding calculate the number, So it's like directed at someone who has that intellectual relationship with God, and it's like, you are the wise man who God's relying on to calculate the number. Or in Proverbs, you're the wise man that God is relying on to lead the lost into understanding, and how understanding and knowledge is something that is appreciated by God.
I think
As
you
well
I think
as-
you were pointing out also in that discussion that it's not necessarily God doesn't expect everybody to be having an IQ of 180.
Mm.
That's not his intention.
Yeah.
Yes, the Bible is understandable, but he also gave some people a special ability to have that level of critical thinking to be able to find that, so they can teach others.
Yeah, but
right?
you don't need. Here's the great thing about the Bible.
Yeah.
It's written in the way that you don't need to have a large IQ to understand it. You just need passion.
Yeah.
If you're passionate about the Bible, you're going to understand it. And yeah, it's written in a way that if you have a high IQ, then you're going to come into it and you're going to understand it from a high IQ perspective. But if you are passionate about it and you don't have that high IQ, and I don't really buy into this whole IQ thing. I think it's a bit of a waste of time, really. People are just different.
Yeah.
People are smart in different ways.
Yeah.
And, well, I mean, there's idiots out there, but God loves them.
Smart at being.
And you're not one of them, right?
Yeah.
Thank the
I
Lord
never said
I'm,
that.
No, thank the Lord that I'm not like one of these, right?
Yeah.
Never said that. Put words in my mouth. But that's the great thing about the Bible. You don't have to have a large IQ.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
You just have to be
The
passionate.
gospel is
If you're passionate about it, then you're going to have
So
a
here's
good
the, here's
understanding.
the verse for that. You shall seek me and find me when you will search
That's
for
a
me
good one.
with all your heart.
Yeah, Jeremiah
You know.
29:13.
Jeremiah 29:13. And that's the key right there, because people are like, oh, I can't find God. Well, go after God with all your heart. Passion. Put some passion into
That's
it.
right.
And,
taste and see that the Lord is good, right? There's a degree to which you
Yes.
have to commit in order to have the experience.
that's right.
You can't just intellectually from afar off have all of the required information and you get it all, you understand it all. It's just impossible.
Mm.
Yeah, you have to get your feet wet.
And that was a standout point from that book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. For me,
Yeah,
was
great book.
the passion that the people of Islamic faith pursue. Not all of them, obviously, but like pursue after.
People often do.
Yeah, pursue after Allah, and that's what Nabil was like. He's like, I'm willing to do anything. God, just reveal yourself to me, and God's like, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Surprise.
You might not like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, that's an amazing testimony. That
I
one.
need to read that book.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
good.
Every
Highly
time you
recommend
bring it
Did
up.
you ever read that book?
No.
Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. It's obviously the story of a Muslim guy, but he finds Jesus, and the story of how that happens is really it's quite
It's
amazing.
Epic.
Um,
Written very well.
So I seem to be the one that keeps like throwing different tangents in here, but I thought came back to me because I have access to your knowledge, and so I'm going to make use of it while you're here. Have you come across this reading of the prophecies in it's in the apocryphal book of Second Ezra, or Second Esdras?
I think I mentioned this to you around Christmas time.
Okay, all right. Because it's something that we chatted about, something that I came across. But there's this guy, he's a believer, a guy that I know or have spoken to a couple of times. I follow his YouTube channel, and there's a quote that he was chasing down. But anyway, it led him to studying the Apocrypha. And out of all of the books in the Apocrypha, he said they're basically all rubbish, from the various lenses, right? Be it that they were, not written by who they claim to be, or they disagree with Scripture. The only book in the Apocrypha that he found had any credibility that he could ascertain was the book of Second Ezra. And it has a prophecy in it that seems to align very, very well with things that are happening in the world currently, particularly in American politics and whatnot. And so he said, look, if it's not true, like that's fine. But I was just curious if it's something that you had come across or read at any point. If it's not, we can just like continue and move on. But
the prophecy about the eagle with the feathers.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so no.
No. Okay, that's fine.
That's probably the easiest one. And so, all right. So there are probably the broader discussion here is the books that are not included in the Bible.
Yeah.
And that's an important discussion to have. And so you've got your apocryphal books, you've got your Deuterocanonical books, you've got your Gnostic Gospels, and a bunch of other sort of lesser ones that are often, you get people on the fringe and say, this one should be included. And then someone will come along and say, nah, that one should be included. And so what we've got to understand is the formation of the canon. So the canon is the rule of Scripture. And the basic principle, there are a number of basic principles that we can look at how the New Testament was put together. But the basic foundational principle is that no new book can contradict a previous book.
Mm-hmm.
And so the original canon is the canon of Moses. And so if you come to the time of Jesus in the first century, you had the Sadducees who would not read anything other than the canon of Moses.
Mm.
The rest of the Old Testament, they completely ignored. Now, Jesus used the entire Old Testament. And so in that aspect, Jesus was a Pharisee. He wasn't Pharisaical, but he was a Pharisee in that he gave credibility to the whole of the Old Testament. And so even when you come to the first century, you've got people who are having this issue over what books should be included in the Bible and what books should not. And so what you can do is you can apply the test yourself, and you can look at any book that follows the original canon of Moses and say, does this book contradict the writings of Moses? And the moment you find a place where it does contradict, then it is automatically not a part of the canon of Scripture.
Yes.
Now, this is when you come down to the first century, you've got your Pharisees who were the more liberal side, because they accepted the entire canon of the Old Testament. But even the liberals would not accept Esdras 2.
Mm-hmm.
And when you've got your liberals that won't accept that, then that's very, very strong indication to us. It wasn't accepted until the Catholic Church came along and said, nah, you Jewish people, we know that you wrote this, but you actually got it wrong because you didn't realize it was inspired.
Yeah.
Because there was material there that they wanted.
Yep.
And that supported their narrative. And so then they included a bunch of those, apocryphal books, deuterocanonical books, etc. And so, we need to bear in mind that the Old Testament and books that claim to be part of the Old Testament are by nature Hebrew books. They are part of the Jewish religion. And it seems to me very, very odd when non-Jewish people come along and tell Jews that they were wrong about the books that they have, even the most liberal Jews. You think about the liberals within Christianity today are very accepting of some really out there stuff. When it comes to something that the most liberal Christians today won't accept, then that's going to be a long way outside.
Way outside the fringe.
Way outside the fringe. And so this is where, Esdras and Maccabees and some of these books, they've got some fantastic history in them.
Yeah.
And we can learn a lot about the intertestamental period from them, but their credibility as books of the Bible just doesn't stand up.
Yeah.
And at the moment somebody's it's Esdras 2 at the moment that apparently is getting some examination. Before that, it was the Gospel of Thomas, and before that, it was there's every few years somebody pulls another one out, pulls it off the shelf, and pitches an argument as to why it should be part of Scripture. And here's the thing. If God is powerful enough to inspire the Bible in the first place, and then he goes to all the effort to inspire the Bible, and then he allows certain books to be lost, God is really stuffed up badly.
Well, that's the argument against Islam, is that the Quran has been, read the book, but is it a whole bunch of the scriptures were edited and lost, and then random stuff was added in, and they can prove the Quran isn't from Muhammad. Is basically the long story short.
No, Muhammad didn't write the Quran. Yeah. Other people wrote the Quran that from the sayings of Muhammad. And you read the Quran. I've read the Quran, and for the most part, it's fantastic. It's full of good stuff. Yep. There's definitely stuff in there as Christians that we would not have a bar of. But there's a lot of really nice things about God.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just going to have to go because I've got a family dinner.
Thanks for
coming
joining
up.
us, Shannon.
And it's that time for me.
You don't want to be late for that.
It's been awesome to catch up with you, Shannon.
Yes, continue, and I'll watch the.
You'll watch the rest of it.
That's pretty good. See you, man.
Yeah, no worries.
Is this your Bible?
No,
that's
a house Bible.
That's a house Bible, local Bible, right?
Yeah.
So
Easy.
we're cooking.
Very good.
See you, man.
See you later.
Since we're talking about intertestamental periods, I feel we're talking about it on Thursday, or was it another time? Anyway, we've been studying Ezekiel with the kids and teens, and one of the resources I've been using is the Bible Project, and they just highlighted that there's differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text in some of the stuff. But I talked to Pastor Luke about that, and that was pretty interesting, just saying that they're both pulling from another source. But correct me if I'm wrong, what's the word again? The apocryphal books are in the Septuagint, but not in the Masoretic text. Is that? I can't remember. So I thought that's part of the credence to why that they were.
We need West Huff.
Yeah, this is
West Half Territory.
Okay, whether they're in the Septuagint or not, and off the top of my head, I couldn't actually mention that. I need to fact check that myself.
Yeah, that's all right.
But having said that, regardless of whether they are included there or not, the Jewish people never took them as scripture.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
They are also in the 1611 KJV.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that the Protestants took them as scripture.
Yeah.
They were included because of his, really good historical value.
Yeah, so I think the reason that Second Ezra is gaining a bit of steam at the moment is because it's got a seemingly prophetic text in it that is like 90% fulfilled already. And if Trump doesn't make it through this term, if he dies or is assassinated or impeached, if he gets halfway and then something happens to him, then
That's in line. With
then
what
it's
it
in
says.
line. Then it's a fulfilled prophecy. So that's why everyone's getting a bit excited, you know. So I'm keeping my eye out. But
Yeah, and this really worries me because it comes down to a popular way of interpreting Bible prophecy, which is where you throw out principles of prophetic interpretation and use the principle of looks like, sounds like.
yeah, I get
Yeah.
that too.
You know,
Yeah,
looks like
absolutely.
this, sounds like that. So therefore, this is where we will shoehorn it in.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
and
a
it's one of
newspaper
those things that even
interpretation.
if it happens, I'm not going to go preaching Second Ezra's on the street, but it
No.
would be pretty interesting.
That's
it would be like,
that's
hey,
the conspiracy theorist in
looks,
you,
yeah,
right?
that's right. Looks
Yes.
like, sounds like is still fun, you know. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, well, there you go.
Yeah. Well, anyway,
Could it
He's
be?
enough of my son to enjoy a good conspiracy theory from time to time. But we have to recognize them for what they are.
Yeah. I think that seems to be like a recurring segment on the podcast.
I may have taken it a step further, but I feel like I'm more like, I am a lot like you were at my age at the moment.
Maybe.
Not maybe.
Maybe.
It's true.
You weren't young and reckless with your theories, were you ever at any point?
Never.
Lyle? Never?
Never.
Never. There we go.
It was beaten out to me, beaten out of me when I went to university.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the advantages of being able to do some years of theology. Is that heading in, full of conspiracy theories. Heading out, it's like, okay, let's bring some balance to this. Let's
Yeah.
apply some principles.
Mhm.
And so yeah, he's probably less reckless than I was.
Okay.
Why do you think there's such a long period of silence in the tradition then, like, of God giving inspired people to the Jews between Malachi and Jesus?
Why do you think there's such a long period between the New Testament and our time?
That's a good point.
So
Well,
What you're gonna find is
that's
this.
an easier question to answer.
what you find is this: if you actually map this out, and I've got
I'm
it,
not going to get a chance to.
he asked me, not you.
This is a podcast,
I'll
not an interview.
I'll ask you next episode.
No, go.
All right. All right. If you look at the period in which the Bible is written and you map it out over the history of the period of this earth, the Bible is actually written during a very, very short period.
Mm.
So it's written across 1,400 years, and within those 1,400 years, there is a 400-year gap. And so the entire Bible fits into a very, very small part of the history of our planet.
Mm.
And so the model is that most of the time, God doesn't have inspired prophets who are writing the Bible. He has people who he has called to follow the information that they have already been given.
Mm.
Now, of course, the first 2,000 years of that, you have oral tradition, and oral tradition is not tradition when you have human beings who are close to perfection.
And also that are overlapping. Like
And that are
multiple
overlapping. So, for
generations.
instance, Adam knows Methuselah. Methuselah knows
No.
Noah.
Oh.
Noah's sons.
Shem.
No, no,
knows
Yeah,
Shem.
Noah's sons, yeah.
Shem knows Jacob.
Mhm.
Jacob goes into Egyptian captivity. So you got 4 generations there.
Mm.
Now, whether they knew each other or not, we
But your point is that Jacob was getting the story of the fall of man third hand.
yes, that's the point right there.
That's right.
And he's also getting it from somebody who is an antediluvian.
Yeah.
And when we consider the antediluvians, that they were so much closer to perfection than what we are, the only reason that writing was invented, and writing was invented around about the time of Moses, maybe a couple of hundred years before Moses, the only reason writing was invented was because human memory was starting to fail.
Mm.
And so it now became necessary to write things down.
Yeah, and because
we
different
were
different
getting
languages
further.
had only been
Yeah,
introduced.
different languages, memory
few
failing,
hundred
and we're
years
getting
earlier.
further from perfection. So if
Yeah.
you've got people that are close to perfection and you're only handing it down over 4 generations, then you can have, it's not tradition, it's actually the word of God.
Mm.
that's being handed down.
It's not hard to pass it on 4 times. It's
Yeah.
hard to pass it on 4,000 times.
That's right. Exactly. That's the point right there. And you know, when we play Chinese whispers today, we are very imperfect compared to an antediluvian. You know, they've just come out of the Garden of Eden. They are close to perfection.
Yeah.
The other thing that so that brings you up to the time of Moses. Moses, when it's first written down in the books of Moses, you have everything you need for salvation. You don't need anything other than the books of Moses. And so, you know, does it become desperately necessary after that? No. Does it become good? Yes, but not desperately necessary. And so from time to time, God would inspire a prophet, sometimes 2, who would live at the same time. You come down to the New Testament, and in the book of Acts, there's about 19. So that's a lot. That's a record. There's no other period in history when you actually had 19 prophets who were living at the same time. Typically, there'd be 1 or 2 or none. That's the standard. And we sometimes read the Bible and like, oh, there were so many prophets, and there was always prophets, and there was always somebody who had the gift of prophecy, and now nobody has it anymore. No, that's an aberration of history. The norm of history is to have no prophet and to rely on the written canon that we have.
Yeah. That's a cool lens to look at it through.
That's a very good answer.
Yeah. I think we often forget, I mean, despite the fact we are technically young Earth creationists, we often forget exactly how long that history is, though. Right?
Yeah.
That's a very long swath of time.
Plenty of time for a lot of stuff to happen.
So when Nabonidus, who was the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, when he became an archaeologist, and he built a museum, and he went on archaeological expeditions and placed things in his museum and interpreted the things that he was digging up through archaeology. He was digging up and interpreting ruins that were just as old for him as the Roman Empire is for us. No, as the first century Roman Empire is for us.
Yeah.
So wrap your head around that. This is Nabonidus, in 500 odd BC, becoming an archaeologist, building museums, interpreting what he is finding.
That's a museum I'd like to go to.
And he's literally digging up artifacts that are 2,000 years old.
It's interesting because I've been listening to some history podcasts, and obviously being of atheistic worldviews, they have fairly long dates on things. And they have, I think one I was listening to this week was on because it's called The Fall of Civilizations. It's a pretty good podcast, and it looks at Africa, the Aztecs, like some really good stuff. But they're talking about like the Sumerians being like 10,000 years ago, and I know the dates can obviously vary for different reasons. But it's interesting how old the civilizations are. And I think they say that the pyramids are as old to Cleopatra as Cleopatra is to us, which is very, very similar to what you're saying.
Yeah.
So like the Egyptians have been around for so long that.
Yeah, and it's interesting.
And that's giving a fairly recent date to
history
the pyramids.
to see history from Europe and history from South America overlapping in time. You've got the Aztecs, and you've got I think this is a combination I've heard before, but fact checks welcome.
Citations necessary.
You've got like the Aztec Empire, and you got Shakespeare at the same time, or something like that.
Yeah, right about that.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be far off. Yeah.
It's just kind of like, whoa, what? Because we think of the Aztecs as being ages ago, and
No, the Aztecs
Shakespeare
weren't that
wasn't that long ago, but no, they were the same time, I believe.
Yeah, I wouldn't know whether that's.
That's about right.
Yep, it'd be about right.
Yeah.
1500 to 1521.
Yeah, there you go.
Which is when Cortez went and smacked some people.
Yeah, smacked them with disease.
Yep.
Biologically slaps.
Biological warfare. That's how the Americas were taken.
Yeah, man.
Well, this has
It's
been
tragic.
This has been kind of fun. I don't know. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to touch on? Like, I know we've been a lot of places. Does anyone else want to do anything before we start pulling some ends together and wrap this one up?
I'm happy to finish.
You happy to
How
finish?
long have we been going?
Like an hour and a half, maybe a bit more.
Hour 23.
Hour 23. There you go. Very cool. Well,
Yeah.
I think that's a good spot for us to wrap up. Well, thank you so much for coming and being on this first like unstructured long form episode that we've done. So appreciate you. We have to get you on next time you come up and have a part 2 maybe.
Would love to.
Cool.
So much fun.
No worries. We'll leave it there. Thank you for joining us for the episode, and we look forward to catching you guys for a regular episode on this Thursday coming. So
Thursday.
we'll see you then. God bless.